May 1st, 2026. Everest Base Camp. A United States government envoy had just landed by helicopter, unveiled an American drone in front of the entire mountaineering world, and Nepal had just told him no. 63 climbers were already above base camp when the permits disappeared. The 2026 Everest season was already extraordinary before any of this happened. Nepal had issued 492 climbing permits, a new all-time record, surpassing the previous high of 479 set just 2 years earlier. 464 climbers were actively on the mountain. China had the most nationals on the south side with 109 permits, the United States second with 76. And for the first time in Everest history, the most critical piece of logistics equipment on the mountain was not a helicopter, not a yak, not the legendary Sherpa workforce. It was a drone. Not just any drone, a Chinese-manufactured heavy-lift UAV that had already proven it could operate in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and that had been structurally embedded into the mountain supply chain before the season had even begun. But then, in the first week of May, everything unraveled. The part I find most extraordinary about this story is that it wasn't about climbing at all. It was a chain reaction triggered thousands of miles from Everest, in the government offices of Washington and Beijing. This is the May update on the secret drone war quietly hijacking the Everest 2026 season. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what was actually at stake before the political storm arrived. In the spring of 2025, DJI, the world's most dominant drone manufacturer, and a Chinese company, deployed its FlyCart 30 drone on Everest for the first time at full operational scale. Over 25 days, that single machine transported 1,259 kilograms of supplies and waste across the Khumbu Icefall. That is the equivalent of roughly 2,700 pounds of oxygen canisters, food, equipment, and garbage being moved through one of the most dangerous stretches of terrain on the planet, without a single Sherpa putting their life on the line to do it. The Khumbu Icefall is a constantly shifting maze of glacial ice, crevasses, and unstable seracs that Sherpas historically needed 6 to 8 hours to traverse on foot, in both directions, carrying loads. 5 Sherpas had already died in the 2026 season before it even officially began. For the first time, it genuinely looked like that death toll could begin to fall. So, who was involved and what had they all put on the line? Airlift Technology is a Nepalese drone company that had partnered with DJI to operate the FlyCart 30 during the 2025 season. For 2026, they had upgraded to the DJI FlyCart 100, a machine in a completely different weight class. The FlyCart 100 has a maximum takeoff weight of 170 kilograms, a payload capacity of approximately 100 kilograms under optimal conditions, a top horizontal speed of 20 meters per second, and a maximum certified flight altitude of 6,000 meters above sea level. That altitude matters enormously on Everest, where Camp 1 sits at roughly 5,900 meters. The FlyCart 100 could theoretically reach Camp 1 carrying 100 kilograms of oxygen canisters in the time it takes a Sherpa to lace their boots. 7 Summit Treks, Nepal's largest expedition operator, had contracted Airlift as its drone logistics partner. Dozens of expedition teams had structured their entire supply chain around the drone. If those drones stopped flying, the logistical backbone of the season collapsed overnight. Here is where the story gets complicated. In April of 2024, DJI had conducted what was described as the world's first successful drone delivery test on Everest, reaching Camp 1 at 6,130 meters. That test was a technological demonstration, but also something else entirely: a signal. China had established a foothold in the most high-profile, high-altitude logistics environment on Earth using its own technology. At the top of a mountain that sits directly on its own border with Nepal, a tripartite agreement was signed between the Sagarmatha Pollution Control Committee, the Khumbu Pasang Rural Municipality, and Airlift Technology to use drone technology for waste management across the Khumbu region. Chinese drones were not just permitted, they were institutionally embedded into the infrastructure of Everest operations, before the 2026 season had even begun. And then Washington noticed. Donald Trump's administration had been pursuing a policy described as Trade Not Aid, a replacement for shuttered USAID programs in South and Central Asia. The drone program at Everest was the flagship demonstration of that policy. Freefly Systems, a Washington-based technology company, had developed the Alta X Gen 2, a professional-grade heavy-lift industrial drone introduced in January of 2026. The Alta X Gen 2 can carry approximately 15 kilograms at sea level and fly for up to 50 minutes without a payload. It had already been flown on Ahmedablam during a film project in 2020, proving it could operate at extreme altitude. 7 Summit Treks, the same company running Chinese drone operations through airlift, had now agreed to also subcontract airlift to test the American drone. The plan was to fly the Alta X Gen 2 from base camp to Camp 1, prove it worked, and establish a commercial precedent for American drone technology in the Himalayas. By the first week of May, everything appeared aligned. The route-fixing team had pushed lines to the South Col on May 8th. Hundreds of climbers were moving upward. The window was opening. The teams were ready. May 1st, 2026. Friday morning. A helicopter touched down at the 7 Summit Treks helipad at Everest Base Camp, 5,364 meters above sea level. Stepping out was Sergio Gore, 39 years old, the United States Special Envoy for South and Central Asian Affairs under President Donald Trump. He had come personally to inaugurate the American drone. A ceremony was held, photographs were taken. The Alta X Gen 2 was placed on the ground in front of expedition operators and mountaineering staff. And then, Nepalese officials delivered the news. Nepal's Ministry of Home Affairs had reviewed the permit application and flagged the drone's geo-mapping capabilities. The mountain straddles the international border between Nepal and China's Tibet Autonomous Region, with the summit sitting directly on the boundary line between the two nations. The ministry cited security sensitivity and drone flying procedures. The full test flight was canceled at the last moment. The drone was showcased, it was not flown. And here's the detail that changed everything for the rest of the season. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what the DJI FlyCart 100 actually is, and why Nepal suddenly saw both drones as a problem at the same time. The FlyCart 100 is not a consumer product. It is a purpose-built heavy-lift cargo drone designed for industrial operations in extreme environments, with a certified operational ceiling of 6,000 meters and a maximum payload of 100 kilograms. But more than its lifting capacity, what made Nepal's government uncomfortable is what it shares with all advanced DJI products. Onboard sensors, high-resolution cameras, and data processing systems built by a Chinese company with a documented relationship with the Chinese government. The Everest summit lies on an international border. The routes crossed by drones pass terrain Nepal considers geopolitically sensitive. Kathmandu had been willing to overlook that concern when Chinese drones were the only option. But when an American competitor arrived and the issue became visible on the international stage, Nepal was suddenly exposed. If they allowed the American drone, they risked offending Beijing. If they only permitted the Chinese drone, Washington would respond. Nepal chose a third option. Nepal's Ministry of Home Affairs issued an order. It applied to both drones operating at Everest Base Camp. The Chinese DJI FlyCart 100 permit was canceled. The American Alta X Gen 2 permit was denied, effective immediately. Airlift technology was left with no operational authorization for either machine. The consequences hit the mountain within hours. Expedition teams that had built their entire logistics strategy around drone service were left scrambling. Ladder sections needed in the icefall could not be moved. On April 28th, just days before the political crisis erupted, a massive unstable Serac had blocked the climbing route shortly after it was opened, injuring one Sherpa guide and one Indian climber. Drone assistance had been immediately requested by the Expedition Operators Association Nepal and the Icefall doctors to assess the damage and locate climbers in the aftermath. The drone had been needed precisely for that kind of moment, and now it was grounded. Quick heads up, every week I drop a new update you won't find anywhere else. Please subscribe. The ban lasted 5 days. On May 6th, Nepal's government told Airlift Technology that its permit was reinstated, subject to completed paperwork, and drone operations resumed on May 9th. In the days that followed, Airlift completed approximately 20 drone flights per day between Base Camp and Camp 1. But the week of grounding had already cost the season something it could not recover: time during the most critical rope-fixing period, when fixed lines were being pushed toward the summit and every logistical delay cascaded upward into climber decisions. Mingma Wangchu Sherpa, managing director of Himalayan Sherpa Adventure, stated publicly that his expedition's entire logistics strategy had been dependent on the drone service. He was not alone. The climbing community was shaken less by the ban itself and more by what it revealed: that the infrastructure supporting their summit attempts was now embedded in a geopolitical rivalry that had nothing to do with mountaineering. When you lay the sequence of events in order, a clear picture begins to form. China established the first drone logistics presence on Everest in 2024, with Nepal's institutional approval and the backing of a signed tripartite agreement. That gave Chinese technology a structural embedded role in Everest operations, before any competitor had a chance to respond. The United States entered the space in May of 2026 under a diplomatic framework that tied drone deployment directly to foreign policy, sending a government envoy to personally inaugurate the technology on the mountain. Nepal, caught between two powers with competing interests in the same airspace over the same politically sensitive border, chose temporary paralysis as a diplomatic solution. It banned both drones, appeared neutral, absorbed the operational cost, and quietly restored the Chinese drone permit after 5 days. The American drone never flew. There is a concept in geopolitics called a buffer state, a small nation positioned between two great powers that absorbs pressure from both sides without fully aligning with either. Nepal is the textbook definition of one. The drone war at Everest in 2026 is a case study in what happens when great power competition descends to 18,000 feet, and the buffer state runs out of room. Every expedition team, every Sherpa, and every logistics company on that mountain became collateral in a conflict they had no part in creating. The 2026 drone disruption did not happen because Nepal mismanaged its permit system. It happened because two of the most powerful countries on Earth decided that a cargo drone flying over the Khumbu Icefall was worth a political fight, and a small country that needed both of them had no good way out. Do you think Nepal made the right call banning both drones, or did the government sacrifice climber safety to avoid a diplomatic confrontation it should have handled differently? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.